Thank you, Presiding Officer. And let me just nail my colours unambiguously to the mast, as I have in previous debates on tobacco. In the 20th century, more people were killed by smoking tobacco than died in all the wars of that century. This is a vile trade that should not exist in the 21st century. But those who have, to quote James VI 400 years ago, been by custom in peace and peace allured to depend upon nicotine, upon tobacco, for daily relief from the stresses of life, are not the people whom we should be attacking in this debate, and I don't seek to do so. They are the victims. They are not the cause of our problem. Now, the bill that's before us addresses the issue of advertising and promotion of nicotine vapour productions, and while I welcome restrictions on a product which is certainly known to not be carrying many of the chemicals which are present in cigarettes and cause ill health and death, it is nonetheless not capable of yet being shown to be entirely safe to be sold. The US Surgeon General's report of 1989 identified 400 separate chemicals in cigarettes, at least 40 of which were carcinogens, many of which were mutagens, many were developmental toxicants. And at this stage, it simply isn't clear whether we have the level of knowledge about vapour products and the chemicals within them, either individually or in combination, and perhaps more critically, when subjected to heat, as to whether we do not have similar problems. And indeed, James Kelly quoted Ash. There's another quote from Ash in the committee's report that identifies that butterscotch with diacetyl and cinnamon, when they're heated to high temperatures, can be another factor in creating harm. And when you take what might be innocuous chemicals and heat them, you can end up with something that can be quite toxic. But if NVPs reduce harm, enable people to move away from the very well-known, well-understood problems associated with nicotine addiction, then fair enough for the time being. I'm prepared to accept them. I want to talk a fair bit about the duty of candour provisions, and in particular, I'm going to get all techie about this, the way in which the bill is actually drafted, because I think there's considerable confusion in the drafting about who persons are. The very first words in the duty of candour are "a responsible person must follow a duty of candour." And yet when you go and find what the definition of a responsible person is, the one thing you discover it isn't is a person. There are 6 different lines in the definition: a health board, a person, brackets, other than an individual who's entered in a contract, and so on. None of these people are capable of being a person. So I think it might be quite useful if a different term were used. Perhaps responsible entity might be an alternative definition. Now, I'm not just trying to pick at this for the sake of it. It's because person is used for other purposes in this section, and I've identified 3 other purposes. For example, if we move on to subsection 2, this section applies to a person to whom something may have happened. But then at subsection 3, it suddenly switches. Instead of saying person, it says individual, when it's clearly talking about the person they've been referring to in subsection 2. And if we go down to the duty of candour procedure itself, at section 22, actions to be taken by the responsible person, we then get a relevant person. But this relevant person appears to be a real person who's an individual, not a responsible person who isn't an individual. And in 22(2)(c), we've got the responsible person has to offer and arrange a meeting with the relevant person, which is highly confusing. And it gets even more confusing if we move on down to the definitions in 2. G, where a responsible person has to make available or provide information support to persons, plural, affected by the incident, and yet it's not entirely clear who these persons, plural, might be. Are they individuals or responsible persons? And then, even more confusing, one of the duties, training to be undertaken by a responsible person. But a responsible person is specifically not defined not to be an individual. So how can an entity that's not an individual undertake training? I'm really not at all certain about that. Now, that's a little rant about that subject. But let me move on, perhaps more significantly, to reporting and monitoring. And in particular, where there have been failures, a report has to be produced. And the second part, 3B, under 24, it cannot contain any information which is, in the responsible person's opinion, is likely to identify any individual. Now, I am genuinely uncertain how that can sensibly be done, because we're looking probably at comparatively small numbers of incidents, and in particular small numbers of incidents of a particular kind that maybe have to be described in the report. And I'm very uncertain that it will actually be possible to produce a report which has to be published, which will not lead it to be possible for that person to be identified. In our statistical analysis across government, we in general terms don't report below levels where there are 5 people involved to avoid that particular duty. Now, responsible person, oh, by the way, responsible person, even though the offences can cover an individual, are not included elsewhere. Now, Presiding Officer, just in conclusion, I just want to go back to a quote I used in 2004 when the then First Minister brought forward a statement on tobacco, quite the best thing that he and his administration ever did, unambiguously, and I continue to praise them to the hope for that. But James VI said of tobacco, a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs, and in the black, stinking fume thereof, nearest resembling the horrible Stygian smoke of the pit that is bottomless. We've known tobacco as an evil, poisonous material for 400 years. Why are we still debating the subject now?